I've gone ahead and done is I've added two new images to our assets folder. One being the grid cell sprite that we'll be using for our grids, and another sprite sheet which contains our items. So let's go ahead and actually load those in. We'll go into our preloader state and we'll load them in just like any other assets. So say this.load the image, and then the key will be grid, or the ID, however you want to call it, and the path will be web content assets image and then grid.png. And let's go ahead and do the same for the items sprite sheet. So let's go ahead and say this.load.sprite sheet. The ID will be items, and then the path will be web content assets image and items.png. Now we actually go ahead and specify how big each frame is in the sprite sheet. So each frame is 128 by 128. Alright, so what we need now is a way to define what our items are. So we're actually going to create a class called item.js. So let's go ahead and create a file. I'm going to save it in our JS folder. Let me go ahead and do that. Go in JS and save it as item.js. And in item.js, we're going to be setting up a class. So let's save our item is a function. Let's pass in a few arguments through there. So we're going to have to pass in the game. We're going to have to pass in the ID of the sprite sheet that this item is in. We need to specify a frame within our sprite sheet, so which frame will be representing this item. We'll need stuff like a name for the item, perhaps a damage number, and a description. And of course, we also need a way to specify how big it will be in the inventory, so how many cells it will take up in the inventory. So we'll say inventory size. Let's open those brackets up. We'll set self to this. And now what we actually need to do is make this class extend the phaser sprite class. So let's go ahead and do that. We can do phaser.sprite and then .call. We need to pass in this, the context, and then we need to pass in the game as well. Then we need to pass in an x and a y. We'll just set them to 0 for now, and we need to pass in our ID. So let's go ahead and actually set the frame to our specified frame, the frame that we want. And now here's what's really cool about phaser sprites is that they have an empty data object, and we can do anything with that empty data object. So we're just going to use it to store our properties like the name, the damage, the inventory size, the description, of course. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do that by saying self dot and whatever, I guess. I'm going to say ttt because why not? So let's go ahead and open that up. We're going to be making it an object, and in here is where we're going to be storing our properties. So let's set the name to the name, set the damage to damage, the description to the description, and the inventory size to the inventory size. So now when we spawn in our item, we actually want it to be invisible. So we'll set visible to false. And then what we also want is to set the anchor point of this item sprite to the middle. So anchor that's set to 0.5 and 0.5. Alright, so what I want now is have a way that we can spawn in our item in the inventory. So let's do self.ttt.spawn. We'll set it to be a function, and we'll take in an x and a y. So whenever we spawn an item, we want it to be visible, of course. So visible is true. And then we also want it to reset at the given position. So reset, all that reset does is just repositions the sprite at a given position. So that being x and y up here in arguments. Now since we are using just one sprite sheet for the items, even though they will be differently sized items in the inventory, because one item might take up 2 cells or 3 cells or even 4 cells. And I'm just going to have the scale set to the inventory size, just for now. So set inventory size.y. Inventory size will be a phaser point. I will explain that later. And of course, we also want to add the item to our stage. So game.add existing, and we'll pass in this. Now, actually, once you create our object, so let's go ahead and say item. Actually, let me not forget the brackets, and I'll add them up here and here. So let's go back to creating our object. So we'll say item.prototype. We'll make that to object.create and phaser.sprite.prototype. Now we need to set the constructor. We'll set it to item.prototype.constructor. We'll set that to be item. So let's go ahead and actually add this to our index file. So I'm just going to copy paste this and change the path to js item.js. So now let's go ahead and actually make our inventory. So let me open up a new file. I'm gonna save it as inventory, inventory.js. And in here we're going to say function inventory. We'll pass in a game, an X and a Y. And in here we're going to have an object which stores all of the things that have to do with the inventory. So we'll say for inventory is just an empty object for now. So now we can actually attach things to this inventory object. So you can say inventory array. And now we're going to have a multi-dimensional array. JavaScript doesn't really have multi-dimensional arrays, but you can have arrays within arrays, which is basically the same thing as multi-dimensional arrays. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to have a 3x3 grid, each 0 representing a tile or a grid cell, and we'll have it be that. So now we actually need to position our cells in this manner that we have specified up here in the array. So let's go ahead and create 2 for loops. I'm going to have a for loop, inventory x is null, inventory x is less than inventory.iArray.length. So we are going through the rows and columns of this array and placing the inventory cells accordingly. So let me do that and then increment inventory x. And inside of this for loop, we're going to have another one for the y-axis. Just do that, replace all of them, and we want to calculate the rows now. So we'll pass in that just so that it goes through the rows now, not just the columns. And wait, I forgot to change that as well. Oops. And now bracket, and in here we're going to place our cells. So let's say var cell. So what I actually want to do is create another class which will be representing our cell. So let's go ahead and create a new class and save it as inventory cell.js. And in inventory cell.js, we're going to have just like we did in the item, say var inventory cell is function. We'll pass in the game, an X and a Y, the ID of the sprite of the texture that it's going to be using. We need to know if it's occupied or not, and if it's occupied, what is it occupied with? So let's go ahead and open those brackets up and set self to this, and let's go ahead and extend this with the phaser sprite class. So say phaser.sprite at call. We'll pass in the context, the game, an X and a Y position, which we'll take from up here in our arguments, and of course the ID. Now I actually want to set the anchor point to the middle as well, so we'll set that to 0.5, and then we can also do things with our empty data object again. So we'll say self.ttt, I'm gonna have it hold if it's occupied. So occupied, we'll set that to that, and the occupied with, we'll set to occupied with. And then of course we wanted to add it to our state, so game.add.existing this. And let's go ahead and create the object again. Inventory cell.prototype is object.create phaser.sprite prototype. And then set the constructor, so inventory cell.prototype dot constructor is inventory cell. So let's go ahead and add those to our index.html file. So let's go ahead and just copy this. I'm going to include my inventory and the inventory cell. So let me change that. So inventory and the inventory cell. Alright, so let's go back in our inventory and actually place these cells. So now we can say var cell is a new inventory cell. We have to pass in the game. We have to pass in the next position. Now, I want to have a global variable which defines how big each grid is. So let me quickly go into the state manager and add a global variable and say app for now. We'll make that an object. And we can say square size, we'll set that to 16, I guess, for now. Alright, so let's go back in our inventory again. And we'll say the x, so that's our offset, plus the app square size times the inventory x. And for the y position, it's basically the same thing, just with y. So app.square size times inventory y. Then we need to pass in the ID. I'm just gonna have it be grid. So since our cell sprites are really small, we want to actually blow them up in size. So let's say cell.scale.set2. We'll make it 10 times bigger, just so that it's big enough so that we can see it. And then we'll set cell.ttt.occupied is false. And then we set the occupied with to null. So whenever we create these inventory cells, we want to set them to be free, so they are not occupied, and yeah, that's it. And now I actually want to replace these zeros by the items that we have just created. So let's go ahead and say inventory.iarray, the index of inventory x and inventory y, and we'll just set it to be square. Alright, so now what I want to do is return my inventory. Alright, so now we can go into our test state. So let me go in test state. And then here's where we can create our inventory. So let's say var inv, we'll set it to inventory. We need to pass in the game through there. And an x position, I'm going to say it to be this.game.world.centerx, and the y position to this.game.world.centerY, and that's it. And let's actually make our inventory to be a global variable so that we can use it across the application. So let's say app.inventory to inv. As we can see, these squares are very closely packed together, and the thing that causes that problem is our square size. So we can actually change this very easily. I'm going to change it to 160 because we have times our scale by 10, so we're going to have to follow that. So let me reset the game. Alright, so now that we have a nice grid, we can actually go ahead and actually try to add items to that inventory. So let's go ahead and make a function which will check if the item is going to fit in our inventory. So let's go ahead and create that function fit check. We're going to be taking a starting point, so wherever we are starting the calculation, we'll actually push in the item size as well. So the goal of this is to iterate through the item size. So say for var x is null, or do x is less than item size dot x, then x plus plus. We'll do the same for the y. Say var y and the item size dot y. I'll increment that as well. And now in here we're going to be needing to check if the x plus the starting point dot x is bigger than the inventory array dot length. So if it's bigger or equal to the length of the inventory. So that just checks that it's not out of the inventory. Yeah, so we'll do or y plus starting point dot y is bigger or equal to app dot inventory dot array dot length. So if that happens, we'll just return false. We cannot spawn the item here because it is all out of the inventory. We can do an else if. So if the inventory array, and we'll take the index of x plus starting point dot x and the y index of y plus starting point dot y. So if that cell is occupied, so say .ttt dot occupied, then we also want to return false because those cells that we are trying to check are occupied. So we'll just return false. And if none of these actually do happen, then we actually want to return true. So let's go ahead and say return true. That means that basically does fit within our starting point. So yeah, let's go ahead and actually find the starting point. We want to actually automate it so that it automatically finds a starting point that we can use to do a fit check. So let's say function find starting point. I also need to pass in the item size. And through here, I'm going to have I'm going to iterate through the whole inventory. So for var x is null, x less than app.inventory.iArray.length, there we go, and increment x. And let's go ahead and do the same for the rows. I'll do that. Say y, and then I'll pass in x through there. We'll increment y. So now we need to actually store this position. We need to store the position of the cells. So let's say var cell is new phaser.point. So all that a phaser point is just think of it as a vector. It holds an x and a y coordinate, and that's it. That's all it does. It's just a point on the screen with a coordinate. So we'll set cell.x to x, so this x that we are running in the for loop, and cell.y to y. Now we need to run a fit check. So we can do if fit check the cell that we have taken and item size that we are also passing in through here. Then we want to actually return that cell, which is going to be our starting point. And if we are not able to find that starting point, then we can return null. So no fit was found, so we'll just return null. Now we need a function which will actually deal with the placement of our item. So let's go ahead and do that. Say, let me create some spaces down here so we can see better. Say function add item to inventory. We need to specify which item do we want to push. Alright, so now we need to find a starting point. So we can do var starting point is find starting point with the item size of item.ttt.inventory size. Now if the starting point, if we weren't able to find the starting point, I'm sorry, if we were able to find the starting point, so if it's not null, then we'll run a for loop. So we'll iterate through the item size. Let's do for var x is less than item.ttt.inventory size.x, then increment the x, copy that, and do the same thing for the y. Alright, so now what we actually want to do is set those met cells to occupied, because we are going to be placing our item there. So app.inventory.iArray at the x index of x plus starting point dot x and the y index of y plus starting point dot y, and we'll set that cell to occupied true. Now we also need to specify what is it occupied with. So let's go ahead and do the same thing, but instead of occupied, we'll do occupied with, and we'll set that to our item that we are passing in. So once that's all done, we can actually go ahead and actually spawn an item in there. So we can say item.ttt.spawn, just like we have done in our item.js here with our spawn function. We're going to run that. We need the what do we need? We need an x and a y. So let's pass in the found. Let's pass in the position of these cells that we have found that we can fit into. So app.inventory.iArray and x index of starting point dot x and starting point dot y dot x. So this takes the position, the x position of our inventory array of the starting point that we have found, and let's do the same thing for the y. So we'll just copy paste this and make a new line and set that to y. Now if we weren't able to find a starting point, then it's either that the inventory is full or something's gone wrong. So let's have an else statement here. So else console.log inventory full. So we're just going to be printing that the inventory is full whenever we don't have a starting point. Alright, so what we want to do now is actually spawn some items in that we can test with. So let's go into our test state. And in here we're just going to be creating a for loop. I'm going to have two different for loops. One is for 1 by 2 items. So let's do that. And we're going to have another one for 1 by 1 items. So let's go ahead and create the 1 by 2 one. So say for var I 0, I is less than 2. So we're going to be creating 2 items that are 1 cell wide and 2 cells high, I guess. Alright, so now we need to create our item. So let's say var item, new item. We need to pass in the game. We need to pass in the sprite sheet, which is items. The frame, which is 1, is going to be our sword. So I'm going to set the name to sword, and the damage we'll set to 1 for now. And a description. The sword is very pointy, so that's going to be our description. Now the inventory size is going to be a new phaser.point. It's going to be 1 by 2. So 1 on the x and 2 on the y. Now we need to actually add this item to our inventory. We can do that by simply calling add item to inventory, and we can add that item that we have just created. Alright, so let's go ahead and create our 1 by 1 items. So let's do another for loop. And we're going to be creating 3 items that are 1 by 1. And we need to create our item, of course. On set new item this.game. The ID is going to be items again. The frame will be null. That's going to be our test tube. So I'll set the name to test tube. The damage, it's a test tube, so it doesn't do any damage, so we'll set that to 0. and a description. I'll write empty or something like that. And we need to specify the inventory size. We'll do a new phaser point, and since it's a 1 by 1 item, we'll have 1 and then 1. And of course we need to add this item to the inventory. We'll pass in the item, and I think I've done something wrong with the inventory with the starting points. Here I've written starting.x, it should be starting point.x, and yeah, that should work. Let's go into our game right now and wait for it to launch. We have an error saying add item to inventory is not defined. In our test state, where is test state? In 48. I forgot a capital A, of course. So let's go ahead and try again. This time it should work just fine. And yay, there we go. We have our items properly being placed on the grid. Here we have our 2 by 2 item, which is the sword, and a 1 by 1 item being the test tubes. So I've gone ahead and added another folder in our assets folder called fonts, and in here is where we're going to be storing our font. So all there is a font.png, which is going to represent each character, and then an XML file, which basically determines the structure of how we're going to be using this image file. So let's go ahead and actually load that in. If I can find the preloaded state, that would be nice. There we go. Alright, preloaded state, and we need to load in a bitmap font. So this.load.bitmap font, we have the ID of font, and the path will be web content, assets, fonts, and font.png. We need to pass in the XML file as well. So web content, assets, fonts, and then font.xml. There we go. Alright, so now we need to go into our inventory, and we're going to be creating our panels that we can actually view the item's details, like the name, the damage, the description, and so on. So let me go ahead and create 2 new functions. Well, actually a few functions. We're going to make a function called item. Oops! Oh crap! There we go. I've deleted everything by accident. Let me do that again. Function item details panel. Pass in a game, an X and a Y position as well. And just like we did with our inventory, we're going to have an object which will store everything that has to do with this panel. I'm going to have a variable which is going to be our size, so the font size. This is a 64 by 64, a 64 pixel font, so we'll use that. Say panel.name is game.add.bitmap text, an X and a Y, the font that we're going to be using, the string, which will just be empty for now, we'll update it later. We'll pass in the size as well. And let's do the same thing for the damage and description. Say damage and then the description. Let's change those to, let's change the Y position, so Y plus size, and then Y plus size times 2. And of course we want to return that panel. Alright, so now we need to go into our item class and add a few events. So whenever we hover over our item, we want the item details panel to change and actually show itself. So let's go ahead and add those just here. So self.events.onInputOver add. So we're adding an event for when the cursor goes over the sprite. So let's add a function to that, and we need to pass in context, so this. And so whenever we hover over, we want to show the item details panel, which is a function that we'll be making right afterwards. And we actually want to change the item details panel to whatever item that we have. So item details panel change, we'll pass in the item through that. So let's actually go ahead and create this panel. So let's go back in our test state, and right at the bottom we'll make a variable called left panel, make that to item details panel. I have to pass in the game through that. Next, in a Y position, just say 100 on DX, and this state .game.world center Y. And we also need a what else do we need? Actually, we don't need anything, so that's fine for now. Alright, so now we need a way to actually update this item details panel, and a way to show it and to hide it. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create 3 new functions. One is going to be item details panel change. So this, all that this function will do is just change the text elements. So just change the text of this to the respecting item. So we'll go ahead and push the item through there. We'll set app.item details panel .name .text, and we'll set it to be the item.ttt.name. So now what we need to do is do the same but for the damage. So let's do that, damage.text to damage like that, just so we have it nice and listed. I'm gonna say damage and then add the string of the damage, just so that we know what it is, because just having a number there is just is not saying anything. So let's do the same for the description. So item details panel .description .text is item.ttt.description. Now we need 2 functions, one that is going to make our item details panel visible, and one that hides it. So let's go ahead and create those 2 functions. They're very basic. So function hide item details panel, set app.item details panel .name .visible is false, and I'll just set everything to false. So the damage will not be visible, the description will not be visible. And now actually let's go ahead and create another function. We'll just copy and paste this because we're lazy, and we'll have it be show item details panel. Instead of doing visible false, we'll set it to true. Alright, so what we need now is some way for our item to catch whenever we hover over it, and that way we can actually display the panel, display the panel based on the item that we are hovering over. So let's go back in our item, in our items class, and in here what we're going to have is 2 events. So let's do self.events.onInput over. So when we are hovering over it, we'll add function. So this function basically gets run whenever we hover over our sprite. We also need to pass in the context for that. That's really important, don't forget about it. So in here, whenever we hover over, we want to show the item details panel, and we also want it to update based on the item that we're hovering over. So pass in self through there, which is basically this item that we will be creating. And now whenever we stop hovering over, So when we go out of the sprite, we'll do self.events.onInput out .add and function. Again, don't forget the context, pass in this. So whenever we go out, we just want to hide the item details panel. Alright, so now if we run into the game, alright, so we can see that when we hover over our items, it actually doesn't appear to be doing anything. That's actually for a number of reasons. First of all, we haven't set our left panel to be public, so item details panel, we'll set that to be left panel. And also, we need to actually make our items be able to capture input. We need to tell it, yes, please capture whenever a cursor goes over, or if we catch a click or something like that. So the way we do that is just do self.input enabled. We'll set that to true. This basically just makes it check that if it's being clicked on or if it's being hovered over on and stuff like that. So now if we actually run the game again, it should work just fine. And whenever we hover over, there we go, sword, damage 1 and very pointy. Seems to be working with our test tubes as well. When I leave it, it goes to invisible, and when I go over again, it changes the text. Alright, so what we want now is a panel on the right that holds the player's stats, and we want to also be able to see how a selected item affects the player's stats. So first of all, we need to go ahead and make a player class. So I just made a new file and say var player function. Actually, let me save this first. Player.js. Whoops, this is the wrong folder. Let me go back really quickly. And oh god. Alright, everything's messing up, but that's okay. Let's just save it. There you go. Function, game. We're gonna take in the game. If my PC doesn't crash, there you go. And let's just pass in damage value. So how much damage does the player have? Let's self to this. The player is going to be a sprite, but it will just be nothing for now. So let's pass in this, the game, an X and a Y, will just set 0, and the key, we'll just make that empty for now. Yeah, so let's go ahead and occupy our empty data object. Self.ttt is an object, and inside of this we're going to have another object called stats, and here's where we're going to be holding all of our stats that the player has. We just have one for now, which is damage. I'm going to set that to the damage that we are passing up here. Let me go ahead and create the player class. So, not phaser, player. Prototype is object.create phaser.sprite.prototype and player.prototype constructor. So set the constructor to player. Alright, let's go ahead and include this file in our index.html. I'm just going to copy paste this. Put this as player.js. Alright, now let's actually go ahead and create our player stats panel. So let's go into our inventory. Here we have also made our item details panel. We're just going to do the exact same thing, but there's going to be a few different things. I'm going to copy these two functions, the item details panel and the item details panel change. And I'm going to put them down here. And instead of item details panel, we're going to have player stats panel. We're still going to take in the game an X and a Y position. This will all stay the same. For the name, let's just have player stats. And for the damage, we don't need a description, so we'll get rid of that. The damage is, we're going to have a thing that's like damage, and then a colon, and then we'll add the player's base damage. So amp.player, we're going to create a player soon. after we do this. So player.ttt.stats.damage. So yeah, this will just display the player's damage. So actually, let me go and change this as well. The player, instead of the item details panel, we're gonna have player stats panel change. We're still going to take in the item, and we just want to have the damage number changed. So actually, let me do app.player stats panel. We'll make all of these afterwards. So let's say text is going to be damage. We're going to have that, and we're going to add the players. Oh, that's a apostrophe. There you go. app.player.ttt.stats.damage. We're going to have the kind of plus that shows, yeah, this is how it's going to affect your stats. So plus item.ttt.damage. So now let's actually go ahead and create the player as a global variable and also a player stats panel. So let's go in our test state, and down here I'm going to say var player is equals to new player, so creating a new player object, and we'll pass in the game through there and a damage. I'm not going to say 0, the player has no damage because he has no items equipped or whatever. Let's say app.player is player, so we just made this global. Alright, so now what we want is the right panel, which is going to be our player stats panel. I'm going to pass in the game through there, a next position, and say this the game the world.width minus I don't know, 800, and for the y we'll just go with the center, so this is the game.world.center y, and we'll also make this a public variable, so right panel. Alright, so now what we want is when we hover over the item, so let's go into our item class. What we want is when we hover over the item, we want to show how we will change the player's stats. So let's go ahead in our onInputOver event, and let's add the item details panel change. Wait, no, that's the wrong one. What was it again? Let me go into inventory. It was player stats panel change. There you go. And we'll pass in self through there. So now when we go into the game, we can see that we have our player stats panel up here, and when we hover over an item, for example the sword, which has a damage of 1, we can see that the player stats adds 1 to our damage. And when I hover over the test tube, we can see that we have no damage being added to our player stats.